So good evening. Welcome to the New School for this launch of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative's New Social Contract. I'm Maya Wiley. I'm the Senior Vice President for Social Justice here at the New School and the Henry Cohen Professor of Public and Urban Policy. We're thrilled to be one of the co-sponsors of this important launch and dialogue and discussion about our new social contract. The Henry Cohen Lecture Series, which I chair, is named after Henry Cohen, who was actually the founding dean of the Milano School where I teach, which is the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy. We're really here at the New School excited about participating in this because, you know, our mission is to come together across discipline to solve the most pressing social problems we have as a society, which includes not just New York City or the country of the United States. We're also a global university, so we think about these things globally as well, and in a transdisciplinary way. And, you know, what I just want to say, because Kathy asked me to share just a few thoughts to get us started, and she said two things to me. She said, be brief and talk about race. One of those things I don't have to be told. You can guess which one. But I'll try to be brief. So the bottom line is, you know, we're really talking about this conversation and the importance of this launch at a moment in time that is also a time of paradigmatic shift for society. It's not a paradigmatic shift that started with the presidential election of 2016. I would say that the election of 2016 is a symptom of the paradigmatic shift we've been under, but it hasn't been a positive one. I'm going to say a bunch of things I think everyone in this room knows because that's why you're here. And that's what we do on the faculty. We say things everybody already knows. And then we get paid and write it up. So the things that you all know is, I would argue that the three primary paradigmatic shifts, they're not the only ones, but if you think about the big things that are shifting the social paradigm of the world, not even just the United States, it's demographics. Okay, that's where you read in race. It is, and all the richness and diversity of what I mean when I say race and demographics, right? Because within that is immigration and migration, and all the reasons for immigration and migration, what that means in terms of indigenous population, what that means for those of us who did not immigrate. Okay, but we did come from somewhere else. Okay, read race. That's just my subtext. But that demographic shift has sped up. It has challenged some of our fundamental spoken and unspoken beliefs about who we are and identity. But we also at the same time have had a deepening chasm of divide of social and economic and political opportunity that has been actually in part linked to that demographic change, right? So whether we're talking about the wealth gap, whether we're talking about the stagnation of wages, all of that. But then add to that the context of environmental shifts and change, right, with climate change, which has created more superstorms, more social some of our immigrants are actually environmental immigrants, right, and refugees. Some of that is also what's happening in our communities, whether we're looking at the devastation post-Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans that we're still building from, but Hurricane Sandy in New York, and now more recently Hurricane Maria, right, in the Caribbean, which is also, by the way, producing refugees, but also significant issues about what we mean by resilience and how we actually tackle some of the incredible problems that climate change is producing. And then I'll add the third, which I always talk about, which is technology. Because as we know, there are many different ways we could talk about technology, but as we know, we're literally at a time in which every major university that's looking at it in one way or another is predicting anywhere from 30 to 50% job loss thanks to technological change globally. How does any society understand or absorb that the speed of transition about what the job economy even looks like when we're talking about that level of shift in a context of greatly increasing wealth and income divides and stagnation, at a time of incredible climate change and all its challenges, and at a time of all the demographic shifts that were already happening and that are being accelerated as a result. All right? So there is no more important time to talk about what a new social contract should look like in that context. And the symptoms are clear. And as I said, the election is one symptom. Many of the things that are actually in the launch document actually is addressing and covering some of the conversations and ideas that we should have. But just to say, we're talking about a time in which students in families earning $160,000 can afford 90% of U.S. colleges and universities, and students from families earning $69,000 or less can afford 5%. That's if they can afford it at all. We're at a time in which we're debating what to do about poverty and whether we've even made inroads, at a time when our data tells us that the anti-poverty programs that we started to create and implement, while they were not always implemented fairly from a racial standpoint, actually helped reduce our poverty rates dramatically in this country. And yet today we have our elected officials saying that it hasn't solved poverty in any way. So food stamps we can talk about cutting, despite the fact that it's one of the major pillars of programs that have kept people out of poverty. And as the demographics of who might need some of those supports have changed, we've used it, the people of color in this country who are coming to this country, as scapegoats to tell white people not to want the programs. Not to want the programs. And there's no better example of that than the expansion of Medicaid, which in the states that embraced and expanded Medicaid saw dramatic drops in lack of insurance and health impacts. Oh, and by the way, with lots of attention to racial differences and disparities in health care, at least at the beginning stages of that policy, and now we're eroding that. And we're even having fundamental debates about whether people who have on average been here since they were 6 years old, some of whom are firefighters, people we typically consider heroes, people who have started businesses, who are employing people, one of the things we say we value as a country, and yet we want now to expel them. And we live in a country in which we have said that the fundamental and primary pillar of democracy, which is the right to vote, can now be challenged for no really good reason in the absence of all research and evidence that we need to make it difficult for citizens to vote because we're afraid of brown people crossing the border. So we're making it more difficult for elderly of all races, for students, for people who live in rural areas who can't afford time off to get an ID that they might have to take a full day off of work to go get, and it implicates people of color even more dramatically. I could go on, you know I could, you know the statistics better than I do. But I also want to say, because that's so depressing, right? That it's also been one of the most incredible times in terms of how we've started to come together, support organizing. We've seen a 19% increase in people becoming activated who have never engaged in these issues before, and for the right issues. That is substantial. And I think we've also come together because, thanks to Nesri, we're going to have this kind of conversation, which is how do we think big? How do we think across the issues? Not just as issues, but in ways in which we want to fundamentally be the drivers of creating the kind of society we believe we all should live in, given the paradigmatic shifts that will otherwise act upon us if we don't make them work for us. So I welcome you to this conversation, and I welcome Kathy Albisa, the founder and executive director of the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative.
I have a long, unfortunate history of having to go after Maya and then bringing the mic down. This happens every time. But thank you, Maya. Thank you for the welcome. I echo that welcome. I want to let's just start first by recognizing, is this not loud enough? recognizing our co-sponsors, Race Forward, People's Action, Resource Generation. You'll hear later from Glenn Harris, the president of Race Forward, and James Haslam, wherever you are, James, who is on the board of People's Action and also the ED of Race and Democracy. But I want to just briefly invite Baden Lentz up to, there you are, from Resource Generation to just say why they're also supporting.
Thanks, Kathy, and good to be here and happy to be brief and not take up too much space with bringing wealthy voices into the room. So I'm Braden Lentz, the Associate Director at Resource Generation. We organize young people with wealth and class privilege in the top 10% of the US economy to fund social movements and to tell the truth that massive wealth accumulation requires massive exploitation to exist. We're gonna hear more about Michael Ratner in a little bit, who's an example of a donor, leader, and organizer, one of Nesri's founding supporters who showed up, bringing all of who he was to movements. And like Michael, Nesri, and other organizations here, RG believes that solutions built by communities are what we should move with, and rather than systems built by and for only a small group of mostly wealthy white people. So the recommendations in this new social contract will help tackle that problem of the racial wealth divide, and we're proud to be sponsoring tonight.
Thank you very much. And this is the first in the Michael Ratner Roundtable series that we're doing jointly here with the Henry Cohen Lecture Series. So I don't know if we, yes, no? Okay, we have a short 1-minute video.
We put a very high premium on what we call civil rights. Free speech, right to vote, all kinds of civil rights. We put almost no premium, in fact zero, on what I call fundamental economic rights. The right to health care, the right to shelter, the right to school, the right to work. Really almost none. And actually our legal system isn't one that can get at what I call fundamental economic rights. My fundamental belief is that I start from economic rights. I start from the guarantees to human beings that their children can be educated, they can get medical care, they can get shelter. And after that, I'm going to start talking about what other rights they are necessitated by. I'm not denigrating unions or free speech. Obviously, I want them both, but I don't want a narrative that says, which is the narrative in the United States. If you have free speech or opportunity, quote, in that, then you have, that's all you have to give your society. I don't accept that.
Right. So I just want to thank the Ratner family for supporting this, and just to say briefly, Michael was an early supporter and a personal mentor to me. It's been a huge loss. We lost him to cancer in May of 2016. But one of the things you'll find on your chair is a postcard with one of his quotes that says, "Change does not happen by chance." Now this is optional, but if you are up for it, before you leave, and some of the pens that we left around, you can share them. If you could, change doesn't happen by chance because we have to work for it, right? And we all do work for it. Every person in this room works for it. But it's not enough to work for it. You also have to know how to dream. Because in order to do this work, you have to know what it's like, you have to know what it feels like to dream of a better world. But because social justice dreams are not individual dreams, they're collective dreams, we're asking you to put a little bit about what you dream of for the world on that postcard. And if you want to leave it in that box in the back, we're going to put your collective dreams together and share them back out. Because I'm pretty convinced that if we see all the collective dreams of justice in this room, we'll be that much better able to fight for them. So think about that before you leave. And in that spirit, we're going to welcome, we thought we'd do, since we're going to be talking so much at you, a short performance by Keita P., singer-songwriter, and the song, not surprisingly, is Dream.
Oh, 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 Dream of the things you'll never know. Oh, dream of the beauty within your soul. When you dream, dream slow. Take the time to let dreams grow. Just dream, just dream, just dream, just dream. Guarantee it will be a reality. Oh, dream through the fears of things unknown. Oh, dream of bounties both young and old. When you dream, never let go. Take the time to let dreams grow. Just dream, just dream, just dream, just dream. Guarantee it will be a reality. Oh, dream not because I tell you so. Oh no, dream because you know that the dream that you dream will light your soul. That the dream that you dream will light your soul. Just dream, just dream, just dream, just dream. Guaranteed it will be a reality. Oh, dream, oh, dream. Thank you.
Thank you. We wanted to have Kita share that song with you because we do need to take the time to let dreams grow. If we're at the time in the middle of all the fight back, in order to be able to fight for. And we've launched this project because while Maya laid out a lot of the problems, we have to really start moving towards the solutions. I think that although we're in a very divided moment, the one thing everyone agrees about is that nothing's working, right? That the system's working for no one. So my first question to you is how many people here think the solutions are going to come out of Washington, right? And it's not even this administration. Okay, well, you want, we'll hear from you later. And the thing is, it's not going to come out of this administration, but it's probably not going to come out of any administration. So we launched this project to sort of build the profile of all the communities that have been struggling against injustice, who in fact have been building the solutions. And we've been looking at very innovative and bold efforts, some which we've been lucky enough to work with partners, others which we're lucky enough to have as allies, in a range of areas, everything from public spending and revenue to public banking and how to transform finance, to our relationship with land and housing, which is pretty messed up right now. Greg asked me if we could use words beyond messed up, but I'm not sure, so I'm trying to be, you'll bring that into it. We look at the need to radically decriminalize and what are the alternatives, and also how to rebuild democracy and revision our labor system, which is also degraded at this moment. And what we noticed as we were pulling that report together, which you can now download online, I was supposed to carry it and I didn't. Liz, why don't you hold it up, because I forgot to bring my prop. As we were putting it together, we noticed that there were themes that connected with these seemingly disparate but interconnected strategies. And one was that they're all driven by people-centered values, and there's a desperate need to have policy and practice that's consistently driven by people-centered value. We also noticed that even though communities were fighting to solve their own problems, their solutions actually didn't just solve their own problems. They would be better for everyone. They were actually potential, scalable, universal solutions that targeted the needs of the most marginalized. And the third thing we noticed is that across the board, it was clear that communities that are on the front line of injustice know that we need to re-envision, reimagine, and redefine what democracy is, starting on the local level. So that became, that's what was speaking to us as we were looking at all this amazing work. And that's how we've organized this conversation. So you will hear from 3 sets of speakers, each talking about one of those themes. And the first ones, which I'll now ask to come up, are Greg Asbed and Carol Anderson. So Carol is the author of White Rage, that won the National Book Circle Critic Award. And Greg is the co-founder of the Coalition for a Immokalee Worker, last year's MacArthur Genius Award winner. He hates when I say that. And I know, I'm going to ruin it for you, Greg. And the strategist behind the Campaign for Fair Food and the architect of the Fair Food Program. So I'm going to open it up with a question and then just step back and let you two speak to each other. Carol, your book, White Rage, has gotten a lot of attention lately. And my question to open this up is, how do human rights values and human rights vision respond to what you coined White Rage?
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for being here. What I want to first lay out is how I defined white rage, because too often we think of rage and white as being like the Ku Klux Klan, or like the folks marching in Charlottesville with the tiki torches, saying, "You will not replace us," or however that went, right? But that's not what I mean by white rage. White rage are those policies that systematically, smoothly, methodically undercut human rights. They undercut Black advancement. We see that trigger when African Americans gain some semblance of their rights, that a wave of policies emanating out of Congress, out of the Supreme Court, out of the White House, out of school boards, out of zoning commissions, systematically go through and begin to figure out, how do we whittle this thing away while looking like we're still on this side of the rights argument? How do we whittle away voting rights while looking like we're still on this side of the 15th Amendment? How do we whittle away your right to quality education while looking like we still believe in Brown? How do we whittle away your right to housing while looking like we're still on this side of Shelley v. Kramer? How do we do this? And white rage figures it out. And the debris that it leaves in its place, where it leaves broken children. It leaves broken communities. It leaves decaying housing where we're asking people to actually live in places that are absolutely uninhabitable, where we've got lead coursing through the water. That's how white rage works. And so first, to understand that it's those policies, that the violence that we often think of is simply a mere symptom of it, but it's the way that the respectable folk allow that violence to happen and then implement those policies. And so where white rage then comes in, where the counter to that has been those communities fighting for their dignity, fighting for their humanity, fighting strategically and smartly. I mean, this is what we saw coming out of the Civil War. It's what we saw with the Great Migration. It's what we saw with Brown. It's what we saw with the Civil Rights Movement. And it's what we saw with the organizing that put Barack Obama in the White House. Those measures, that kind of work, that kind of community-based work is in fact the massive trigger for white rage. But one of the things that becomes very clear is that the community never said, dang, that's it, man, can't do nothing. But said, no, son, not today, Satan, step back. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I've lived and worked in Florida for the past 27 years of my life on this earth. And Florida is a state that is not unaccustomed to white rage. And I work in a community that is a farm worker community, a community made up mainly of people who pick fruits and vegetables for a living. Quick question, does anybody here pick fruits or vegetables for a living? Okay. That's an important question and an important fact, just to kind of keep in the back of your mind for a little bit. And that industry that we work in and that we're organizing in, that we're fighting to change, as you said, has been defined from day one, when you think about the history of U.S. agriculture, by that sort of philosophy, by white supremacy, by the lie of white supremacy that says some people can own other people to do work for free, and if they don't do it, we can kill them, because they're not really people. That gave us U.S. agriculture. There's been an arc since, but that arc has not bent toward justice that far quite yet. The New Deal, which is one of the more important bendings of the arc in our country for a lot of different populations, excluded farm workers, precisely to get the votes of Southern Democrats and domestic workers for reasons of race. So all that has continued, and to this day, and just to give you a little anecdote of how it continues, even in the program that we have created, which has really changed people's lives immeasurably. In the early days of the program, there was an organic grower in Florida who was well known for being, sort of the prototypical progressive organic grower. And we were talking about the shade provision, the provision that required shade in the fields, right? Now, if anybody's ever been in the South in the summertime in 100+ degrees and working for hour after hour, you know that shade is something you'd like to be able to take advantage of every now and then, right? But his position was, that's ridiculous. Why should we have to provide shade? These people love the sun. That's a quote. Not one told to me, one said to me, right? These people love the sun and they don't need that whatsoever. Well, he needed, in the end, he had to put in shade. But much to his chagrin. But that is the kind of system that we have found and that we have been working since the early 90s to change. And we've used the human rights framework to do so.
And one of the things that I love about the human rights framework, I started my work, actually, let me talk about the first book, Eyes Off the Prize, the United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights. 1944 to 1955. And it began because I was trying to figure out how my neighborhood became the hood. I was trying to figure out how in my neighborhood, with all of those God-fearing folk who got up and went to work every day, who loved their children something fierce, all checking all of those boxes about, if only you would, if only you would, if only you would, and they are doing, and to systematically watch that neighborhood collapse right in front of me. And I'm thinking about, these are the folks that when you walked into their home, they would have the Trinity on their mantle. That's not Jesus, God, and the Holy Ghost. That's Martin Luther King, right? Jack Kennedy, right? And Abraham Lincoln. They had the Trinity there. They believed. And so how did something as powerful as the civil rights movement leave us with all of these communities that are absolutely decimated? And that's what began the hunt for the quest for human rights in the United States in my work. And the power of that is that I saw in the mid-40s, coming during the Second World War, how African Americans were conceptualizing their struggle not as a civil rights struggle, but as a human rights struggle. They were saying that the vote is powerful, and we're going to fight for the vote. But we need quality education. No, we have a right to quality education. We have a right to quality health care. We have a right to quality employment, jobs with a living wage. I mean, as they're going down that list, and they are fighting like crazy for it. And then the second Red Scare, all of the communist witch hunts, the aligning of this frame with communism, and watching their allies and their organizations put under such stress. But what I saw in that moment, though, was that they understood that this wasn't just about black folks' rights. This was about people's rights. This was about, if we can change this system to honor the humanity of people, then we're going to have a truly just system. And that hell of a war that we just came through, where you've got like 60 million dead, that it will not have been in vain, because we are going to have a society that values human beings. And I saw black organizations working with a range of other peoples in this coalition to in fact create this just world. That was the power of the human rights frame for me, that it began to whittle away at one of the things that white rage work is so good at: divide and conquer, and the zero-sum game, that the only way that you can get will be at my expense. Human rights just blew that thing wide open, because it was like, there's enough here for everybody. The problem is that it has been distributed so horrifically wrong that you've got folks who are doing everything they're supposed to do and can't breathe.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it, that the community itself feels the power of human rights, and that was certainly the case in our case, right? The community that makes up Immokalee is, equal parts Guatemalan, Haitian, Mexican, indigenous from Guatemala and Mexico, all places where they have been leading struggles for years with incredible strategies and techniques for organizing and for fighting far harder opponents, far more vicious opponents than we often do here. And so they have always seen their fights in terms of human rights, in terms of fundamental human right to live, and And so when we started organizing, that was what came out of the community. But then the interesting thing is that we had to find a way to translate that to the rest of the world, because we knew that as farm workers, we could organize all day long, and our power was limited. There was not, when you are as poor as farm workers are, you can't do what workers generally do or used to do to have power at the workplaces, withhold your labor. When you are so poor that you withhold your labor and you have to go back to work within 4 or 5 days, you find out that that leash is not long enough for you to be able to bite the person you're trying to bite. You get yanked back, and you go back to work, and the whole thing loses force. We did that several times ourselves down there. So we realized that there was another path we had to find. We found we had to build power. We analyzed and we saw the different sources of power that were making farm workers poor, right? And we can get into that maybe in a little bit, but the main issue at this point is that we needed to build power that the community itself didn't have. So we had to communicate this situation with others. We had to find who had the power that we could harness in order to make the change we wanted to make. And that's what's beautiful about the human rights framework too, which is that it doesn't really it's not aimed at the head. It's not aimed at conscious sort of intellectualism. It's aimed at the gut when you think about human rights. You mentioned it, the war, the decade of the 40s was the most violent, most evil decade in modern history. I mean, just pure, unadulterated evil. And it was like an orgy of just death. And it sounds kind of weird to put it in those terms, but that's what it was. People, whether it was Hiroshima or the Holocaust or just people fighting, people died by the millions. And so that woke us up as a people, and when that nightmare ended, out of it came the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was essentially a catalog of all the evil stuff people do. I didn't say the word I was going to say, evil stuff people do to others, and flipped it on its head and said, this is what you shall not do in the future, ever again, right? And so that, it's all based on this visceral reaction we have when we see these things happen. And so we were able to actually tap into that, and what we do, if I got a second, yeah. So a lot of times when I'm talking to a new audience, an audience that's new to the question of farm labor, or to the countryside for that matter, which is kind of why I asked how many people work in the field. I asked them to do a thought experiment with me, just a couple minutes, right? So put yourselves in your minds on a country road with farms on either side, right? And you're driving, and everybody's been at some point out there. I know this is New York City, but I know everybody's been on a country road at some point in their lives. And there's farms on both sides, and then you roll up and there's a farm stand with all this beautiful fruit and vegetables picked straight from the field, right? And you like to eat that sort of stuff, so you roll in, you park, and you get out, and you can't believe what you're seeing. It smells beautiful, it's colorful, most perfect watermelon, peaches you just want to eat before you pay for them. And so you fill your bags and you go to the cash register, and the person there is very nice, and they're ringing you up. And as it's going on, you're thinking about how much longer you got before you got to eat that food. And just as they're about to finish ringing you up, a horrible scream comes from just behind the cash register in the field where the stuff came from. And you look up over the cashier's shoulder and you see a woman being sexually assaulted by her boss in the back of a truck. In the field where your food that you're about to buy comes from. And then as you're looking at the field, you realize there's another guy on the other corner who's being beaten. He's trying to shield himself. He's being beaten and kicked by his boss because he stopped to drink water at work instead of working. And at that point, the cashier turns to you and says, "That'll be $21.75. Big smile. What would you do? Would anybody finish that purchase? Would anybody take their money out of their pocket and finish that purchase? No, right? That's the power of human rights. You can strip everything else away. Strip the distance between people and where food comes from. Strip all the thing about what kind of person is it that's getting sexually assaulted in the truck. Take that out of the equation, right? Take all those things away and just strip it down to that violence, to that essence of violence. It's something that we all, through empathy, can't accept. And there you touch people in the gut. And when you do that, then you have access to their minds. And then you can bring analysis and everything else in and help figure out how they can lend you their power, and we can work together to fight power with power and change the conditions that come out of all that.
As you know, Greg, I went on a couple of the of the protest marches down in Florida with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and wow, and to be there in that moment. So we're marching, and we're marching against a grocery store that didn't care that, you know, when the atrocities that are happening in the field were brought to them, they were like, what do we care if there are atrocities? It's not our business. And we're like, no, son, not today. Not today. And in that group marching, and I was marching alongside Kathy, I'm looking up, and for me, it looks like humanity. I'm seeing black folk and brown folk and white folk and Asian folk. I'm seeing folk. And we are marching. And we understand why we are marching. We are marching for dignity. We are marching so that the abuses that are happening in the field don't happen. We are marching so that people can be paid a living wage, so that they can actually live. I mean, it sounds like, but in the fields, folks are working so hard, and they have nothing to show for that work. And we're like, no. And as we're marching, there was this moment where this pickup truck rolls by. Yeah, you know the kind.
Central Florida now.
And starts yelling that we need to go back where we came from, and they want their country and what the heck doggone ever. And here again was the power of human rights. Two things emerged from that just I went, wow. One is I saw a resilience in that group, because as they were yelling, go back to where you came from, everybody there was none of that kind of division about who was an immigrant or who was an American or any of that. We were one, because that dignity that was being violated was violating all of us. The second piece is that the resolve to go, no, son, not today, but it was done with a kind of lack of toxicity, right? So to be able to be resilient, to fight for your dignity, and to do so while also maintaining your humanity, wow, that was some serious power there. And that's what I see in this struggle, using human rights as the frame.
I knew this was going to be the hardest part, ending each of these. Yes, I know, right? That's next time we'll do an hour each, see if people can do a marathon. But, you know, one thing that you can see in the report or on the CIW website or on the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility website is what emerged out of that struggle. Yeah. The most extraordinary solution that has transformed farm work. So I really encourage you to read about it, to look it up. But let's just say that if you read the end of the story, it's got a great ending. Thank you. I forgot, because I seem to have forgotten everything today, that we actually have this thing called a hashtag. And it's hashtag New Social Contract. If you want to make comments or ask questions, we'll be monitoring it if you're that sort of agile person on your phone. And now we're going to invite our next two speakers for their conversation, Nijmi Zarinko and Amara Jones. Amara is a journalist. She is with The Last Sip, and Nijmi organizes in Pennsylvania. She is a co-founder of Put People First Pennsylvania, which is the anchor for the Poor People's Campaign in the state, and one of our partners at NISR. So Nijmi, I'm going to give the opening question to you. You have worked both in a very targeted way on racial justice in the school to prison pipeline work that you did in Philadelphia with the Philadelphia Student Union, which in fact was associated with our Dignity in Schools campaign, and you started the Racial Justice Action Work Group at Roadmap. But you're also as deeply committed to multiracial organizing and reaching out to poor white constituents in Pennsylvania and unifying urban and rural constituents. So given that, the question is, do those strategies ever overlap, intersect? Is there a relationship? And how does that inform your thinking about this notion that John Powell coined of targeted universalism that we mentioned earlier?
Great, thank you, Kathy. I'm really honored to be here, and I really want to appreciate you all for having me. It's a very intense time for me, both personally and also politically, with the Poor People's Campaign that launched recently in over 30 states around the country, and there's 40 total states participating in it. So it's a very significant time, and it's a very intense time. So I just want to say thank you, and I hope I have something to offer to you all tonight. So I guess to answer your question, I'll say I'm a revolutionary. And so I think that to that end, I'm really committed to building strategic power. And so sometimes when you're a revolutionary, I don't think it's always about being the most radical or saying the thing that seems the most radical or the most sort of out there. It's actually about making strategic choices about how do we build power, like the folks we're just listening to, the amazing leaders we just listened to change the situations that we face. And before we started this, Amara and I were just talking about, Amara was telling me how, there's buildings in this city, new buildings in this city that are 60% unoccupied, right? And we have, I don't know how many people I passed by sleeping on the street just to get here. And so in that way, I think the human rights framework is a revolutionary framework, because it's actually revolutionary to claim our rights to the basic necessities of life, especially at a time when we see that the future of work and labor is such that we will not have the means to purchase those basic necessities of life. And so the basic question that confronts us all as a species is, how are we going to let this thing go down? Right? And so getting ourselves in the mindset and the heart set to be able to face those questions, I think is the real work. And for that reason, it's not a contradiction. We need all communities working internally and working across each other to be able to face and confront, what we have coming our way.
I think one of the big challenges in this moment is how to take the idea of revolution, the idea of change, and to actually actualize it into something that's real. And a lot of the ideas that are being put forth as bold, such as college for everyone, that's not bold, right? You're essentially figuring out a new way to finance the same system for more people that still has unequal incomes coming in and most likely unequal outcomes going out, right? It's not revolutionary. And a lot of the ideas that we have are not adequate to the scale of the problem. And I think that that's one of the things that's really exciting about this project, is that it gets us to think about problems that can be equal to the scale of the problem. That if we add them all up, that they actually will lead to a society that looks radically different. That's what we have to have. And one of the things that Kathy just talked about was the idea of targeted universalism. And for everyone who isn't familiar, I wasn't familiar with it a year ago, and I like to think that I've read a few things. The idea of targeted universalism is that you set universal goals, universal standards, you want universal outcomes, but you have various ways to get to them. And so how does that differ from what we have now? Well, we have either targeted programs or programs that we say are universal. So, for example, a program that is a targeted program could be, for example, certain affirmative action programs. And we know that those have been politically vulnerable because they can be too readily identified with a certain group of people. That certain group of people using American history American history can be weaponized against those group of people, as we saw in the last election, and the programs then begin targeted for removal. Or they're universal, such as Social Security, or they're labeled as universal, but the problem with universal programs is, one, they're not necessarily universal. So Social Security isn't necessarily for all workers, right? It is for the majority of workers that are in a certain type of work, but they're not for all workers. So domestics for a long time, that's one example. So how do we come up with new solutions that take kind of the goals of these two buckets and puts them together into something new that's targeted universalism? And I think that one of the important things that we all have to think about as we're beginning to think about the policies that we want to advocate is the fact that we have to, actually I heard in an interview that I did with Kathy here at the New School, Mia Charlene White, who teaches here, said something that was very powerful. We have to have ideas that allow us to hold contradictions. Right, that one of the reasons why we have fallen into the trap is because our language is very didactic. We are faced into these either-or choices, and that our culture is didactic. And so it doesn't actually allow for us to come up with ideas that are humane and sustainable, because it's easy to put, my gain is your loss is my gain. And so that's the entire conversation. That's how we're in this trap. One of the ideas that is an example of targeted universalism in certain ways would be, for instance, a universal funding standard for all school districts in the United States. That we come up with what does it look like to have a school system to be fully funded in the United States? And then we look at across the board all the school systems that don't meet that, and then we figure out a way to get them there. Now, it's universal in that we have a universal goal. We want to have schools that are able to have certain outcomes. We want them to have the resources that allow them to have outcomes. Schools and education are labor-intensive exercises. There's no way to technology our way out of learning, because human minds are not digital. They're not electronic. They are analog. They need people that are there guiding them, right? But what funding looks like is not going to be equal. You can't say that every school is going to get $5,000 per pupil, right? That's not going to work given the differences and the changes. So it's ideas that allow us to get out of the trap of being either or didactic. It's ideas that allow us to be bold, and that allow us to have contradictions, that allow us to have the idea that you and I we may not necessarily benefit in the same way for what's happening, but the idea is that we have goals that have certain outcomes, and that we do that strategically and we do that holistically. And one of the things, just to come back and land kind of where you said, one of the things I said before is that when you look right the way across history, suffering doesn't bring about revolutions or change. Humans have an incredible ability, frightening ability, to endure terrible pain, injustice, you name it. That capacity is sort of unnameable. We haven't lived in a society like that universally, so we don't know, but if you look in history, people can endure a lot for a very long time with things not changing. When revolutions happen, it's because people suddenly have hope. They have that. There's an idea that there is a different vision. What was the difference in France in 1789? Well, one, they say that there was an environmental crisis in part, but it's also the fact that the Enlightenment happened. And the idea is that the majority of people aren't supposed to be living like this. That you're supposed to have rights just because you are here, human rights, just because you are here, and that those rights then mean that you should be able to live in a certain way in which you're not subservient, in which you're not poor, in which you're not all these things. And you marry the suffering with the hope, with the new ideas, and that's when you get change. And so that's what we have to do in this moment. Resistance isn't enough. It's what's the hope.
Yeah, right on. That's so right. And I would just co-sign that by saying it's conditions and consciousness, right? The conditions are the one aspect, but the consciousness is the other. And to go to the actualization that you talked about, how do we actualize what we're saying? So my organization in Pennsylvania, Put People First PA, is a statewide, grassroots, multiracial organization of poor and working people, that set out to do an impossible task, which is to organize the state of Pennsylvania across color lines to win healthcare as a human right. There's a lot there. But one of the things that helps us to actualize that is the human rights principles. So in order to advance, we really, really do have to understand our history, right? And we have to understand our history of racism and white supremacy. And we have to understand how the separation of people in this country has been viciously enforced for hundreds of years. And so actualizing some other kind of vision means that we have to actually have ways of working together that start to address and break that down. I was just at one of our leadership institutes in Pittsburgh, and we had two testimonies from two of our members. One of our member Senda, a leader in Somerset, which is a rural place. She's a black woman who grew up in Ohio, and she talked about growing up and being in her daycare center. And the first time she learned about racism was when a white family came in and asked why she was laying down for nap next to a white boy. And the next day, the daycare center, when she came in, they had put a sheet up, a screen up, so that they actually wouldn't be next to each other. So that was her lesson. And we heard another testimony from Donna, who's a poor white woman in Pittsburgh, talking about how when she was a teenager and she went down south, she was on some kind of church trip, and because she was coming from the north and going down south, and she told them that she went to an integrated school, they made her lay down on the floor and they beat her, and they told her to repent because she went to an integrated school in the north. So these are real enforcement, right? A vicious enforcement of that color line. And this is part of what we also need to understand, right? It wasn't just that, we by nature hate each other for how we are and how we look. These have been brutally and viciously enforced, and there's a price to pay, right? There's been a price to pay for a very long time of contravening those lines. And so what the human rights framework does with the principles of universality, everybody in, nobody out, right? That forces us, when we have folks, to really they have to face, what does everybody in really mean? And everybody in means that you may have to think about that from the vantage point of folks you may never have interacted with before. But if you're in and you believe everybody in, then that's everybody with no exceptions, right? And equity is about everyone puts in what they can and gets what they need, which means that not everyone has the same needs. Not everyone is coming with the same things to put in, right? So equity, that's targeted universalism, is equity. It's not about being equal. It's about people actually getting what they need. Transparency, accountability, and participation. So these are the principles that we use. And so that's part of the consciousness of developing, like, how do we imagine what a new society could look like and what new systems could look like? Well, they've got to have principles. It's not enough to just say everybody in, nobody out, without equity, without transparency, accountability, and participation.
One of the things that you kind of or that occurred to me was you were speaking about is stories, and the power of stories in terms of connecting empathy, right? I'm gonna do a shameless plug. I have a television show. It's called The Last Sip. It's a weekly news show that is predicated on a lot of the ideas that we're talking about, that the solutions come from historically marginalized communities. And one of the reasons why I feel so passionately about it and why I feel passionately about these things in general is the fact that story is it. Who controls the story, who controls the narrative, controls who and what's as important, period. It's really pretty straightforward. There's actually a book called Homo Sapiens, and one of the ideas embedded in it is that humans have no natural comparative advantage in the wild. There's nothing special about us, right? The only thing that we have, and at the times and histories when humans broke out, right, a couple 100,000 years ago, was at the same time that we developed language. And one of the things that language does is that it allows us to tell a story about ourselves that allows us to act in concert in major ways, right? I can get on a plane and I can fly to Alaska. It's 12 hours away. And when I land in Alaska, I can interact with the people there, mostly, along some defined ways. How can I do that? I can do that because we basically, we tell ourselves that we're part of the same story, right? We're part of the same people. I've never met them. I don't know what their way of life is, but we have a story about how we are and how we've become. And one of the most important things in all of this within the idea of human rights, because one of the problems, right, is that not everyone is viewed as human. Human beings don't view all human beings as human. It's one of the reasons why a black man, if he reaches for his cell phone, it's deemed to be threatening. He's shot to death. A white man can walk into a school, murder 20 people, and be taken alive. The story about who they are is totally different. So one of the things that we have to do in terms of getting to the idea so that we can get to the policies, so that we can explain what targeted universalism is, so that we can talk about the ways in which our human rights connect us, is the fact that we are part of the same story. So what's that story? And that story now has to be more expansive. It has to include not only beyond race, it has to be on gender. Harvey Weinstein supposedly turning himself in tomorrow. It has to be on issues of LGBTQ people, because one of the things that happens is that systems of oppression don't work fragmented. Systems of oppression work in concerts. And so therefore our solutions, the stories that we tell ourselves, et cetera, we have to be as big and as implacable and as patient as systems of oppression, because they are all those things. And they're really good at telling a story that allows them to continue.
We're gonna
Yes. And I think one of the most hopeful things, just to end on a hopeful note, is the fusion intersectional work being done by the Poor People's Campaign to really hone in and say these things are all connected. They cannot be separated, and they have to be addressed together. And so, thank you.
Thank you.
Seems that the theme that our hashtag is picking up primarily is the need to be hopeful. So there seems to be at least some consensus on that. The next set of speakers are going to hopefully leave us hopeful about the future of democracy. So inviting Glenn Harris and James Haslam. Glenn is the president of Race Forward, with about 25 years of work on racial equity in localities, and James Haslam is the executive director of Rights and Democracy in Vermont and New Hampshire, and on probably every national network board you could think of, and one of our national leaders. So I'm going to launch with a question. You, Glenn, you often say you can't have democracy without racial justice, and you can't have racial justice without democracy, which I always thought was a great line, but I never knew exactly what you meant. So could you tell us what you mean by that?
I was so hoping that was clear by itself. Thank you, Kathy. Let me just quickly to just acknowledge, thank you to Kathy, thank you to all the other panelists. It's so powerful. It's hard coming up here last, don't you think, James? Yeah. But it's great to be here. Talking about democracy, several of us have named it. Talking about democracy right now is a little tough. People hear democracy and it doesn't tend to make most people excited. And so excited about the opportunity to really name, get real about why we've got to win that back, why it's so important. And for me, that quote that, we can't get to an inclusive, functional democracy without racial equity, and that we can't actually get to racial equity without democracy is at the core of that idea for me. Been spending a lot of time thinking about Vincent Harding, civil rights leader, author, all-around genius, and his simple quote, which is our question: is America possible? That's what he was positing was the work of the civil rights movement. That's what he was positing as the work of social justice here in the United States. And I think that question feels more real today in this moment than it has in a while. But as profound as this moment it is, the reality is that this question in this moment has cropped up every 60 or 70 years for us in this country like clockwork. Right? We jump back 60 years, we got the civil rights movement. We jump back 60, 70 years before that, we're in the period of Reconstruction. It is like clockwork because it is the great unanswered question of our country, right? Is simply, can we have a functional democracy? And at the root of it, from the birth of the country, as Van Jones says, there was the American dream and the American reality, right? A dream of equality and democracy, and a reality that fell way short of that. And it's that struggle, that question, that has been driving us since we began as a nation. It is the question that is back in front of us again. And I think the power for me in that is a reminder that we are a very young nation. The truth is, we talk about our founding as if it was done. And in fact, right now what we're doing is we're founding this nation, right? We make no mistake about it. And at the core of that is this question of, can we get to equity and justice, and can we do it collectively, democratically? And so when I name that, that's what I'm trying to start to tease out. But that journey, and James and I are hoping to talk a little bit about, like, how do we reclaim democracy? How do we reclaim that idea in a meaningful way?
Can you hear me? No? Okay. Sure. I guess. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. Really, truly an honor, and to be here with Glenn and all the incredible speakers and organizations that have put this together. This is something that is near and dear to my personal heart, and I really do, feel like everything that has been said here is what we are often struggling to think about and fight for where we live. I'm the executive director and founder of an organization called Rights and Democracy in Vermont and in New Hampshire. And, it's called Rights and Democracy for exactly this reason. We think that, in many ways, as Nijmi was saying, is, we really should think of ourselves, and as was just saying, is, this is a human experiment of us trying to get it right. The American Revolutionary War isn't over. We are revolutionaries if we really want to have a democracy. We think of it as, very much that, you can't have a democracy without racial justice and vice versa. But you can't have really any kind of justice without democracy, and you can't have democracy without human rights. We see they're all fundamentally connected. As we were talking about with the last speakers, the systems of oppression are absolutely connected, and also the systems of rights and democracy cannot be divided. Partly, one thing that is someone who's been working on human rights now for a little over a decade, using the human rights framework, people often think of human rights as something that is a kind of a legal term, or if they know about the Universal Declaration. And as an organizer, we think of it as things that we fight for. We win them. They're power struggles. They're power struggles for dignity and for respect, and ultimately for love and the values of our communities against the systems of greed and the people who are benefiting tremendously at everyone else's expense. And so we think of democracy in the same way, that it's something that we can come together and we can fight for and we can claim. One of the experiences in some of the photos in the book and before is a campaign that in Vermont for healthcare as a human right, and that was a campaign of claiming that right. It was not in our Constitution exactly in Vermont, but it was something that everyone needed and wanted to fight for, and part of that it was a power struggle to change what was politically possible. We passed a groundbreaking law. We saw how it was interconnected to many other rights. In fact, when we passed the bill, right at the end, they excluded undocumented immigrants from the bill. And so partly we ended up having a very quick 5-day campaign with the beginnings of a new farm worker organization, Migrant Justice in Vermont, to get this amendment stripped out of the bill. And we see how these things are used to divide our communities, as Nijmi was talking about, and how we need to unite across them. But we also, when the politicians and the people in power there ended up thwarting the universal law that had been passed, we very much see it as a power struggle for democracy. That our opponents are using every tool in their toolbox they could possibly have to divide us and keep us from this vision that started before the American Revolution and that we're still fighting for now.
Beautiful. And I love that you were naming democracy is an act of claiming power. And I think one of the things at Race Forward is we think about sort of race and social justice and the intersection with democracy is how are we defining democracy? And way too often folks hear democracy and they think ballot box, and that's the end of it, right? And we really have to expand our notion of what democracy means and to think about what it means to democratize not just government, but our institutions across the board, right? And as you were talking, it was really triggering for me, just sticking with government for a moment, because it is not just the actions of whether or not we are able to win at the ballot. It is also about the people who are implementing those decisions that determine whether or not we get any real benefit out of them. I was thinking about a group of folks that we've been working with in Seattle who have from 5 communities. It's basically the Asian American community, the African American community, and East African community. One neighborhood that's fairly multiracial, right? But all coming up against the very real realities of gentrification that we know are literally killing our communities across the country right now. And folks started with some basic demands of local government, of the city, of we want you all to pass some legislation for us to actually rethink what our current planning and zoning practices look like. And that process started now like over a decade ago. But the piece that was really exciting to me is that over the course of those demands and over the course, I'm going to come back this as a set of ideas, and over the course of the city itself, government employees talking about what does equity and what does participation and ownership look like, the city moved from talking about that in piecemeal to creating an office for equitable development. And this past year, the city set aside $16 million for investments in those communities that were most impacted by, and let's get real, $60 million is not a lot of money. But to at least as seed funding for folks to actually think about what it meant to have ownership of and be able to stay in their communities. And at the beginning of this year, the community and the city went one step further, which was those very neighborhoods should be the folks who decide what to do with that money. That is democracy in action. It is not simply do we get to make a choice about what we get, but we get to decide what we, personally, what we actually want to do with it in terms of how it's determining the impacts of our lives. So I think in that way, we have to continue to deepen this idea of what democracy means and what ownership of our institutions mean as we're thinking about how we move forward.
It's great. You know, one of the things I like about the framing of this new social contract is that, again, it doesn't drop down on the sky for these are the solutions. They are solutions that come out of our communities because, you know, democracy is something that it means that people that are impacted by decisions have a say in them. So you can't drop them down on people. They have to be part of it, you know, as Glenn is saying. And one of the big pieces that we tried in Vermont that was a very interesting kind of experiment in reimagining democracies, we were starting a campaign for a people's budget. We thought that the state budget, the way that it happened, it impacted our lives, our families' lives, our communities in so many dramatic ways, and yet it really was not part of democracy other than, you know, having a choice every 2 years to vote for people that will make these decisions. And even then, a lot of the people that we were voting for, when they came in, they were really kind of nibbling around the edges of a lot of the major decisions that were about, you know, the fundamental things around education and healthcare and the things that our communities need. And the fascinating thing about this, and I really liked Maya's opening remarks framing it in this context, is when we started this campaign for a people's budget, right when we were launching it, we got smacked with, it was called Tropical Storm Irene. And we were just about to go out and do a whole bunch of community needs assessments in our communities. And the irony was that about 30% of the state was in total crisis. And so thinking about human rights and democracy, I think right now, as we go through this ecological transformation, you know, having resilient communities where people can make decisions that impact them is more important now than ever. And you know, it was fascinating to be thinking about these big picture questions around, you know, people's budget and the needs of our communities and meeting the needs of our communities in this area of crisis, like, you know, Hurricane Sandy here. You know, in some respects, we saw glimpses of, you know, of our values of our community in action. We didn't think twice about going and making sure that everyone who had been affected by this had a place, a safe place to be housed, to have food, to have access to clean water, and so on. And our community rallied around that. And then we kind of went back afterwards, after things were cleaned up, to the old way, where we didn't, you know, pass people on the street that don't have any housing. And so, you know, partly, you know, that is making our institutions really kind of be the hubs of those values. And that's where it was the idea with a people's budget. So it wasn't just kind of regurgitating year after year what we were doing and then having an austerity fight about what's going to be cut. It would be going out to our communities, doing needs assessments, finding out what people needed to have in their communities, what the priorities were, having principles, as we was talked about, guide that budget. And we actually still have in writing, we haven't operationalized it yet, human rights principles in the Vermont statute for what the budget should be operating under. And that's part of, you know, kind of reimagining what is possible with democracy.
I love this idea of thinking of our institutions of hubs of our values. Can you imagine that, and if that were true? And it triggers for me, I wanted to come back to this, about the importance of government employees. Some government employees get more love than others. So if I say teachers, people are like, right on, right? If I say your average bureaucrat, not so much. But the reality is that, especially for us at the local level, government is 1 in 6 people in the United States are employed by government. Government is the single largest employer of communities of color. It is the single largest employer of communities of color at living wage jobs. The reality is that if you want to find the one sector that looks most like our country, if we were just talking about diversity, it would be government. The overwhelming majority of people in government, especially at the local level, share our values. They represent a great untapped resource for us as we think about what does it mean to make democracy real. And I think in that way, one of the pieces that we've really leaned into with we have a project called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, is really trying to engage local government and its local government employees and thinking about what is their role in promoting democracy, real democracy, and promoting and holding equity. I just wanted to name, there's a lot of things that we've won, us lovers of justice have won, that fall real short in their implementation. And here in New York, the city of New York spends annually over $18 billion on contracts and services. That was with a B, just in case you were wondering. And of that $18 billion, only 3% go to women and minority-owned businesses, right? And everybody in this room could do the math. The bottom line is that annually, women and folks of color in the city of New York, based on policies we've already won, are losing over $8 billion a year, annually, just in the city of New York. It's not in that instance that actually the policies are not in place for us to actually get those monies. It is in fact the failure of implementation. It is in fact the failure of thinking about how we invest in business development within our communities. But all of those require it for us to really think about how do we embed community decision making into the implementation practices of our local government, and how do we actually empower the folks inside government, not elected officials, who many would be happy to see us do that tomorrow, to help actually bring their leadership to the forefront and thinking about what the implementation of local democracy looks like. So I think in that way, it's just really critical that we continue to think about how we can get creative about redefining what democracy looks like for us locally, and the ways in which we can translate that into meaningful power and meaningful resources for community.
That's excellent and very connected to a lot of the stuff that we've been trying to get our heads around. Especially as you say, that so many times we've had major wins fall short in implementation. Partly, because it is, this big power struggle, we see it as oftentimes, this idea of like, we want to change policy, but oftentimes we leave the game of changing policymakers to other folks. You look at what our opponents do. We essentially think we need to do everything that they're doing, just the opposite for like the light side of the force. And they have very sophisticated strategies to unelect people that are champions of the things we care about and to put in their folks. And so a lot of the effort that Rights and Democracy's kind of sibling C4 organization is thinking about is like, how do we have people that actually represent our communities be the people in those policymaking situations, and how do we make it so that the movements don't just sort of rally outside the building, but people that are making the policy are actually reflecting and representing the movement when they're making it, and we can have that kind of accountability as part of the democracy we're fighting for.
I love, and the beauty in where you just ended, James, is that we heard it all at multiple examples tonight, that the solutions we're looking for, we already have them. We just need to get them to scale. And I think in that way, this just wanting to name this reality that local is national, and we've confused it for way too long. We've named it inverted. And just so excited to have the opportunity to share stage and hear about some of your great work. Thank you all.
You need to stop
Thank
now.
you, Kathy.
Thank you. You need to run. Theme that people most picked up on was imagine if our institutions were the hubs of our value, were hubs for our values. That would truly be democracy. So I am going to now invite Scott. Where are you, Scott? Oh, there you're right there. Didn't see you. Scott Nakagawa of Change Lab. He's going to give us some final reflections. And let me hand it over to you then.
Okay. The cocktail hour is almost upon us. So, a lot got said. I'm not going to try to repeat it all. But I do appreciate all that people brought because I found it incredibly inspiring. And I do believe that the first job of the activists is to be inspiring. So we hear all this bad news, right? Climate change is coming. A wave of automation that could throw 30 to 50% of us out of work. All of these things that point to a dystopian future. It's all so scary. But the job of the activists is to actually look for the silver lining, to push forward regardless, even if we have to make the road by walking, right? Because our job is to inspire people. So I'm going to talk about silver linings that you all kind of pointed to. But first I want to say, that I think what we're looking at here is a situation in which we're really not ready for this future, in part because for decades we have been making public policy on the basis of nostalgia, right? People are now rejecting that backward-looking way of making public policy and are starting to reject the kinds of institutions through which that kind of policy has been made, right? There's an opinion piece in the New York Times right now, David Adler, where he looks at liberal democracies around the world, a big sample of them, and arrives at the conclusion that the group least supportive of democracy and civil rights are centrists, right? Lots of people are surprised by that, but is it really surprising, right? It's not surprising at all. When you think about our own history, for example, right? We had a civil rights movement. Up until that time, most white Southerners were Democrats. They believed in and wanted their unions. They had public benefits programs that they believed in and they wanted. All of a sudden, the door was open to others, and they decided they would give it away instead of sharing it. And they have continued to do that. And we see that happening all over the world now in places like Holland and Poland and Hungary and Great Britain. We see this happening, right? One of the legacies of colonialism is that nation states and ethnicities go together, and as the world opens up and globalization opens the door to migration from all over the world to these core industrial nations, we see people saying, well, if we have to share this, we're going to give it away, right? The thing is, though, that phenomena that we are witnessing is an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity. Because the people on the edges, who, however we may define democracy, right and left, are actually wanting something quite different. And that rejection of the center opens the door for us to walk through into the future. So we heard from a bunch of people who are conjuring up visions of that future, right? All of these little experiments in democracy, in economic development, and community building, these things that we are witnessing now, that people talked about, these are all centers of hope and opportunity. What we need to do is take those centers of hope and opportunity and bring them together, right? Make the whole greater than the sum of its parts by framing it within the context of our values and beliefs and real ideas about how to move forward. That's what this project is attempting to do, and why I love it so much. So I want you to ruminate on that and think about that and hold on to that, right? Because the future in front of us is one that may be full of peril, but for every bit of danger we face, there is also opportunity. We live in a time, right here in the United States, where something is happening that no nation on earth has ever survived. The core group, the ethnicity upon which this nation was founded, is losing the majority, right? When that happens, typically nations fail. So we have no templates to look back to. But what we do have are prophets, and we just heard from some of them, and that's what we need, right? We're really good at criticism. I'm really good at criticism. I criticize everything. But we are in a time when we need prophets. We need to start to reach for the future boldly and recognize that we can't rely on templates of the past, but we have to invent the future that we want. So, are we ready to do that? Yes? Okay. So I want to thank everybody who spoke and Kathy for this opportunity, and remind you should read. Yeah.
That was an amazing way to close. Now don't forget your postcard. When change comes, it is unpredictable, but it does not happen by chance. And what people said, that we do have the solutions, so now we just have to prepare to move them forward, and as Scott says, listen to the prophets. I want to thank everyone who came to help us launch our report and our project, and all the speakers. You heard from a lot of people, because it takes a lot of people to move these things forward, and it took a lot of community struggles to generate these solutions. So thank you to the Ratner family, to Karen in particular, to our board members who are here, to our honorary advisory board members, who you can see their bios in the program, who have supported us. To the new school, thank you, Maya Wiley. Thank you, Lisette Sarajevo. Thank you, Nora Smiley, who with Lisette organized all the logistics around this. And thank you to the Nesri staff, and mostly thank you to all of you.